They said no one survives the desert alone, but what they didn't say is that something can survive it for you. The first light over the Arizona horizon looked almost gentle that morning, but beneath it the ground was already radiating heat like a living thing. Miles away from any paved road, a shape moved across the endless sand, slow and deliberate, refusing to collapse even when everything around it suggested surrender. It was a German shepherd, coat pale as bone-white dust, each step dragging faint trails behind him like unfinished sentences written into the earth. His name was Ghost, though no one was there to call it out, and the only sound he made was the steady rhythm of effort against exhaustion. Strapped loosely to his side was a sealed black case, compact, reinforced, marked with no visible insignia, as if the world had been told to forget it existed. Inside a remote operations center nearly 80 miles away, Agent Daniel Mercer stood frozen in front of a flickering satellite feed, his eyes locked on static that refused to resolve into clarity. The system had gone dark for Ghost 12 minutes earlier, a clean disappearance that should not have been possible under standard protocol. Mercer's voice broke the silence in the room, low and controlled but carrying weight. "He's still moving," he said, more to himself than anyone else, as if saying it out loud made it real. Around him, analysts shifted between monitors, but none of them spoke, because they all knew what it meant when a classified asset kept moving after losing all support signals. Out in the desert, Ghost continued forward, his breathing steady but heavy, as though he had learned to measure survival in steps instead of time. The wind shifted, carrying heat across the open flats, and somewhere in that movement there was a faint metallic rattle from the case he refused to release. It was not random. It was deliberate, as if the object itself had weight beyond its physical form, as if it mattered more than rest, more than safety, more than instinct. Far behind him, the faint outline of Echo 17 appeared on the horizon, an abandoned military relay station marked only by broken towers and weather-worn concrete, the kind of place that no longer appeared on official maps but still existed in memory. Ghost adjusted his path toward it without hesitation, as if he recognized it not as a destination but as a conclusion already written. Inside Mercer's command room, a second alert flashed across the screen, triggering a brief moment of silence that felt heavier than any alarm. A secondary transmission fragment had been recovered, distorted but intact enough to carry fragments of audio. A voice, barely recognizable beneath static, whispered through the speakers, "If he makes it back alone, it means we didn't." The words ended abruptly, leaving only the hum of equipment and the realization that Ghost was not returning from a routine mission, but from something that had already erased its own footprints. Mercer leaned closer to the display, studying the faint thermal trace of the K-9's movement, his expression tightening not with fear, but with understanding. Ghost was not escaping the desert. He was carrying something through it, something that was never meant to be carried alone. The heat shimmered over the dunes as the dog finally reached the outer perimeter of Echo 17, pausing for the first time in what seemed like hours. The structure ahead stood silent, half buried in sand, its doors slightly ajar as if the desert itself had been invited inside. Ghost did not hesitate. He stepped forward, the case still locked against his body, and crossed into the shadow of the abandoned station where the air suddenly felt colder, not from temperature, but from absence. Somewhere deep in the system, another signal tried to form, failed, then vanished again, leaving only one remaining certainty in Mercer's mind as he watched the feed stabilize for a fraction of a second before distortion swallowed it once more. Whatever Ghost was carrying had already changed the shape of the truth before anyone had seen it. Inside Echo 17, the silence was not empty. It was structured, like the remains of something that had once operated with precision and purpose. Dust hung in the air in slow motion, disturbed only by the faint movement of Ghost as he stepped across the threshold, each paw pressing into concrete that had long since lost its official designation. The interior corridors stretched forward in fading lines of gray and rusted metal, illuminated intermittently by weak emergency lighting that flickered as if unsure whether it still had authority to function. The black case remained secured against his side, its surface catching brief reflections of broken light, revealing nothing about its contents yet hinting at weight that was not measured in pounds alone. Somewhere deep within the structure, a secondary system attempted to boot, failed, and then settled into a low mechanical hum that sounded more like memory than machinery. In a secured operations facility 2 states away, Agent Daniel Mercer was no longer standing, but seated now with both hands resting on the edge of the console, eyes fixed on the unstable telemetry feed that had partially reconnected for reasons no one could yet explain. The signal from Ghost was faint, fragmented, but present, like a heartbeat returning after a long silence. Around him, technicians worked to stabilize the data stream, but Mercer barely reacted to their movement. His attention was locked on a single anomaly. The K9 was no longer moving randomly. Every step now followed a precise internal pattern, as if guided by something beyond navigation systems or instinct alone. "He is not lost," Mercer said quietly, voice measured but heavy with recognition. "He is following instructions." No one responded immediately, because instructions required a sender, and the sender in this case was supposed to be offline. Inside Echo 17, Ghost paused at the center of a junction where 3 corridors split like veins in a forgotten body. The air was cooler here, carrying traces of old equipment and long-abandoned power systems. He lowered his head slightly, not in hesitation, but in calibration, as if listening to something that human ears could not perceive. The case shifted subtly as he adjusted his stance, the faintest metallic sound echoing through the corridor. That sound triggered something deeper in the facility, and a dormant panel on the wall briefly illuminated, revealing faded lettering that read internal relay access restricted. Ghost did not react to the warning. He turned left. At that exact moment, Mercer's system registered a second incoming fragment, this one stronger than before. Audio recovered from an embedded recorder began to play through the speakers in the command center, distorted but coherent enough to carry meaning. It was Ghost's handler, voice calm but strained, speaking in measured intervals. "If this reaches you, it means the external channel has failed. Do not attempt retrieval through standard protocol. The asset is no longer operating under standard protocol." Mercer's jaw tightened slightly as he listened, because that language was not procedural, it was survival code, used only when command hierarchy had been compromised. Outside Echo 17, wind moved across the desert in long, uninterrupted waves, pressing against the structure as if trying to erase it from existence. Inside, Ghost continued deeper, passing through narrow passageways lined with inactive terminals and dust-covered monitors that once displayed operational data now reduced to static gray screens. His pace never increased, never slowed. It remained consistent, deliberate, as though he had memorized the structure long before arriving. Mercer leaned closer to the display as a new thermal signature appeared within the building. Not Ghost's, but something stationary located near the core chamber. "There is another heat source inside," a technician reported, uncertainty in their voice. Mercer did not look away from the screen when he replied. "It is not a person," he said. "It is what he is delivering to." The corridor ahead of Ghost opened into a larger chamber where the ceiling had partially collapsed, allowing thin streams of desert light to filter through fractured concrete above. In the center of the room stood a sealed containment pedestal, its surface marked with identification codes that had been deliberately scratched away. Ghost approached it slowly, stopping at a precise distance, as if acknowledging a boundary that could not be crossed without consequence. The black case at his side emitted a soft electronic pulse, responding to proximity rather than command. In the command center, Mercer's screen briefly stabilized enough to show a clear visual feed for the first time since the desert. His eyes narrowed slightly as the image resolved. "That is not cargo," he said, almost to himself. "That is confirmation." The audio feed from the handler continued, fading in and out like a voice carried through deep water. "The truth is inside the system. If the K9 returns, it means the system chose survival over silence." Ghost remained still in front of the pedestal, his breathing steady but slower now, as if the weight of what he carried had finally reached its intended destination. The desert outside Echo 17 remained unchanged, vast and indifferent, but inside, something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. Mercer watched the stabilized feed with a growing awareness that what he was witnessing was not an extraction or a recovery. It was a delivery that had already been decided long before the mission began. The chamber inside Echo 17 seemed to respond to Ghost's presence in ways that were not mechanical but anticipatory, as if the structure itself had been waiting for a specific sequence to complete. Dust particles drifted through shafts of pale desert light, illuminating the sealed pedestal at the center of the room, where the black case now rested against Ghost's side with a subtle vibration that had grown more consistent over time. The German shepherd stood still, not in hesitation, but in completion, as though arriving here was not the end of a journey, but the activation of a condition that had been dormant until this exact moment. In the command center, Agent Daniel Mercer watched the feed stabilize into a clarity that had not been present since the initial signal loss, and what he saw made him shift his posture slightly forward, because Ghost was no longer behaving like a field asset, but like a component in a larger system that had just acknowledged its own endpoint. "Confirm internal chamber lock," Mercer said calmly, and a technician responded that Echo 17 was still listed as abandoned, with no active protocols registered for the last 12 years, yet the system logs were now updating in real time, as if being rewritten from within. Ghost lowered his head toward the pedestal, and the black case emitted a soft tonal pulse, followed by a faint unlocking sound that carried through the chamber like a decision being made rather than a mechanism releasing. Mercer narrowed his eyes as the audio feed from the handler reactivated again, this time clearer than before, as though proximity to the chamber was restoring fragments of corrupted data. The voice spoke with controlled urgency. "If you are hearing this, then the primary containment cycle has failed and only the secondary witness remains active." Mercer repeated the phrase quietly, recognizing it as part of a protocol classification he had only encountered once in archived briefings labeled non-operational doctrine. The term witness did not refer to observation, but to preservation, specifically designed systems that ensured certain information survived even if entire command chains were removed. Inside the chamber, Ghost stepped forward one measured pace and placed the black case directly onto the pedestal. The moment contact was made, the pedestal illuminated with a soft white glow, not harsh or alarming, but steady, like an acknowledgement rather than an alert. Across the chamber walls, dormant screens flickered to life, each displaying fragments of encrypted data streams that began to align themselves without external input. Mercer's console mirrored the same sequence, and his voice lowered as he spoke again. This was not a mission extraction. This was a controlled transfer. No one responded, because the implications were already forming faster than language could comfortably contain. The handler's voice returned, now carrying the faint distortion of distance and time compression. The K9 unit designated Ghost is not carrying classified material in the traditional sense. He is carrying verification. Ghost remained still, but his eyes shifted slightly toward the pedestal, as if confirming that the sequence had completed correctly. The system responded instantly, projecting a single line of data across every active display connected to Echo 17, both inside the facility and within Mercer's command network. The line read Operational Truth Seal confirmed. Mercer's expression tightened, not in fear, but in realization, because truth in military systems was never a discovery, it was an authorization. The audio feed continued. If the facility is reactivated, it means the original event was never recorded, only preserved through alternate carriers. Mercer leaned back slightly, absorbing the weight of what that implied. Somewhere in the original operation cycle, something had been removed from official memory, not destroyed, but deliberately unregistered. Ghost had not been sent to retrieve evidence. He had been sent to restore existence to something that had been administratively erased. The chamber lights stabilized further, revealing inscriptions along the pedestal that had been invisible moments earlier, detailing a protocol chain labeled Echo Witness Continuity Sequence. Ghost finally stepped away from the case, sitting down with slow precision, his posture relaxed but attentive, as if his role had shifted from carrier to confirmation observer. Mercer's voice came quietly now, almost reflective. He was never off-grid. He was the grid. The handler's final recorded message played through the system with increasing clarity. When all command fails, the witness carries what command cannot allow to survive. Not weapons, not orders, only truth. The audio ended without warning. leaving the chamber in silence, so complete that even the mechanical hum of Echo 17 seemed to fade into background absence. Ghost looked toward the exit corridor, then back to the pedestal, then remained still, as if awaiting a new directive that would never arrive because the directive had already been fulfilled. In the command center, Mercer studied the stabilized feed as the system marked Echo 17 as reactivated under a classification that had no operational authority attached to it. The final status update appeared without human input. Continuity confirmed, witness protocol complete. And in that moment, it became clear that Ghost had not returned from the desert with cargo, nor with intelligence, but with the preservation of something that could not be allowed to disappear twice. In the silence that followed the activation of the witness protocol, Echo 17 no longer felt like an abandoned facility, but like a sealed memory chamber finally reopened after years of intentional absence. The desert wind outside pressed gently against fractured concrete walls, carrying fine grains of sand through broken vents, as if the outside world was trying to listen in on what had been uncovered inside. Ghost remained seated near the central pedestal, his posture calm and steady, but his eyes carried a fixed attention that suggested awareness beyond immediate environment, as though he was still synchronized with something larger than the room itself. In the command center, Agent Daniel Mercer observed a new layer of system behavior emerging across all linked networks, where previously dormant classification nodes began to populate with structured data under a heading that had not existed in active military databases. Continuity Reconstruction Layer. Mercer did not speak immediately, because the system was not simply revealing information, it was rebuilding context from fragments that had been deliberately scattered across time. A technician broke the silence carefully, stating that satellite telemetry confirmed Echo 17 was now broadcasting on a closed-loop frequency that required no external input to sustain itself, a condition that should not have been possible under any standard operational framework. Mercer finally responded, his voice measured but heavier than before. It is not broadcasting. It is remembering. Inside the chamber, Ghost shifted slightly, and the black case on the pedestal responded with a final soft pulse before its surface dimmed, as if a process had completed its final verification cycle. The pedestal screens around the room transitioned from encrypted lines into structured visual sequences, not video recordings in the traditional sense, but reconstructed data impressions, showing segments of a prior operation that had never been formally logged. Figures moved through abstract representations of desert terrain, communication channels flickered and then faded, leaving only timestamps and classification markers that had been stripped of identifying origin. Mercer leaned closer to the display as a specific sequence locked into place, showing Ghost's earlier movement patterns mapped across the desert, not as random traversal, but as a precise relay path between points that no longer existed on current maps. The handler's recorded voice returned once more through the system, now fully synchronized with the chamber's restored processing layer. If this message is active, then Ghost has completed the return path. Do not interpret this as recovery. Interpret it as validation. Mercer repeated the word quietly, validation, understanding that the system was not confirming survival, but confirming accuracy of a concealed event that had already shaped operational history without acknowledgement. The data stream expanded again, revealing a layered incident index labeled Echo Null Event, a designation that carried no description, only status indicators marked unresolved, unacknowledged, and preserved. Ghost stood slowly, turning his head toward the pedestal as the final segment of the system engaged. A single line of text appeared across every connected interface, both in Echo 17 and in Mercer's command center. Witness integration complete. There was no alarm, no escalation, no procedural follow-up, only silence following confirmation, as if the system had concluded that no further action was required. Mercer exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on Ghost's still form in the feed, recognizing that the K-9 was no longer functioning as an asset within an operation, but as the final physical anchor of an event that had otherwise been erased from institutional memory. The desert outside Echo 17 remained unchanged, vast and indifferent under the midday sun, but inside the structure, something fundamental had shifted in how truth itself was stored. Ghost walked forward one final step and stopped at the edge of the pedestal light, not crossing it, not retreating from it, simply existing within its boundary, as if confirming that his role had reached completion. In the command center, Mercer closed his eyes briefly, then reopened them. As the system transitioned Echo 17 into a permanent archival state under autonomous witness classification, no personnel were assigned. No retrieval orders were generated. Only a final system note remained active, stating continuity preserved beyond authorization. And in that moment, it became clear that what had traveled across the desert was never meant to be recovered or controlled, but only to ensure that something the world had once been made to forget would remain impossible to erase again. The final stage of Echo 17 did not feel like an ending, but like a system transitioning into a different form of silence, one that was no longer empty but maintained. Across the desert outside, the afternoon sun continued to burn without change, casting long, sharp shadows against broken structures that had once served operational purposes now erased from official maps. Inside the facility, Ghost stood motionless at the boundary of the pedestal light, his white coat reflecting a soft glow that no longer flickered, as if the entire chamber had stabilized into a permanent state of recognition rather than activation. In the command center, Agent Daniel Mercer remained seated, his eyes fixed on the main display where Echo 17 had shifted into a sealed archival classification layer labeled Witness Continuity Complete. There were no further system alerts, no pending tasks, no follow-up protocols, only a sustained flow of quiet data reinforcement that confirmed the structure was now operating independently of command oversight. A technician nearby noted that all external access points to Echo 17 had been automatically disabled, not by human instruction, but by internal system decision logic that no longer required validation from external authority. Mercer listened without interruption, absorbing the implications without allowing them to break into immediate conclusion, because what he was witnessing did not behave like an operation conclusion, but like a transfer of custodianship. The handler's final recorded sequence reappeared one last time, not as audio this time, but as a synchronized text reconstruction across all linked systems, stating simply that the witness protocol was never designed to deliver intelligence, only to preserve continuity of truth through non-human carriers. Mercer repeated the phrase under his breath, continuity of truth, understanding that it implied something had been considered too unstable or too dangerous to exist within conventional documentation systems. Inside Echo 17, Ghost finally lowered himself into a resting position, not as an act of withdrawal, but as a completion state, his breathing steady and unchanging as if synchronized with the facility's stabilized core. The black case, now fully integrated into the pedestal system, emitted no further signals, yet the room itself retained a quiet hum that suggested ongoing internal preservation. Across the chamber walls, the reconstructed data streams gradually dissolved into static neutral displays, not erased, but compressed into archival silence. Mercer leaned forward slightly as a final system message appeared, confirming that no further external monitoring was required, as the internal witness framework had achieved autonomous preservation status. He stared at Ghost through the stabilized feed, realizing that the K9 was no longer part of any operational chain, but had become the final reference point for an event that could not be reclassified, rewritten, or removed. Outside, the desert wind continued its slow movement across Echo 17, carrying dust across metal and stone as if time itself had accepted the structure's permanence. Inside, nothing moved except the subtle shift of light across Ghost's white coat as he remained still, not waiting for instruction, not anticipating extraction, but existing as confirmation that something once erased had been restored in a form that no longer required permission to endure. In the command center, Mercer finally closed the log interface, leaving only the sealed classification record visible on screen, marked permanently as continuity preserved. And in the absence of further signals, it became clear that the mission had never been about retrieval, but about ensuring that even when systems fail, when records vanish, and when commands are silenced, something will always carry the truth forward beyond the limits of control. The desert night arrived over Echo 17 without ceremony, as it always did, lowering temperature and sound in equal measure until the entire landscape felt suspended between breath and absence. Inside the facility, the artificial lighting had shifted into a stable low-intensity glow, casting long, steady lines across walls that no longer displayed active data but retained the faint impression of what had once been projected there. Ghost remained in a resting posture near the pedestal, unmoving except for the slow rhythm of his breathing, a presence that now felt less like a deployed unit and more like a fixed point within a system that had completed its final calculation. In the command center, Agent Daniel Mercer continued monitoring the sealed classification feed, though there was no longer any active requirement to do so. The system had entered what it labeled autonomous preservation mode, a state where no external commands were accepted and no internal modifications were permitted. A technician reported that all attempts to ping Echo 17 returned a single response: witness integrity stable. Mercer did not immediately respond, because that phrase carried a finality that did not invite correction or interpretation. Instead, he reviewed the last reconstructed sequence once more, watching as fragmented data lines aligned into a coherent historical record that had not existed in any official archive. The handler's final transmission appeared again, not as audio or text, but as synchronized system memory, stating that truth does not require visibility, only continuity through a surviving medium. Mercer leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on the stabilized status marker, understanding now that Ghost was not functioning as a courier, nor as a passive observer, but as a living boundary between erased history and retained existence. Inside Echo 17, the silence deepened in a way that felt structured rather than empty. Even the faint electrical hum of the facility seemed to have settled into a constant frequency, as if acknowledging that its purpose had shifted from operation to preservation. Ghost lifted his head once, slowly, scanning the chamber not with alertness, but with confirmation, as though verifying that no further action was required. The black case, now fully integrated into the pedestal system, remained inert, yet its presence continued to influence the room's ambient stability, like a memory encoded into physical space. Across all connected systems, Echo 17's classification updated one final time, removing all references to operational status and replacing them with a single designation: Continuity Anchor Site. Mercer studied the change, recognizing that it meant the facility was no longer considered a location of activity, but a fixed reference point in the broader system architecture of recorded truth. A second technician quietly noted that all satellite imaging of the area now displayed minor distortion patterns, not enough to obscure visibility, but enough to prevent precise analytical reconstruction of internal layout. No one corrected the observation, because it was consistent with the same principle they had already witnessed. The system was not hiding Echo 17, it was stabilizing it beyond interpretation. Inside the chamber, Ghost stood once more, taking a slow step forward before stopping at the edge of the pedestal light. There was no urgency in his movement, no hesitation, only completion expressed through presence. In that moment, the facility's internal sensors registered a final alignment across all subsystems, confirming that no further input was required from any external source. Mercer closed his eyes briefly, not in exhaustion, but in recognition of closure that carried no emotional resolution, only structural permanence. When he opened them again, the system had already transitioned Echo 17 into a fully sealed archival continuum, inaccessible through conventional command pathways. The last visible line on his screen remained unchanged: witness continuity stable, no further transmission required. Outside, the desert wind moved across the ruins with steady indifference, yet inside the facility, something had achieved a state that no environmental force could alter. Ghost remained within that space, not as a subject of retrieval or analysis, but as the final enduring confirmation that even when history is removed from record, it can still persist through the one form that was never meant to interpret it, only to carry it forward without alteration until the moment it is no longer needed. The transition into the final monitoring cycle at Echo 17 did not come with any audible confirmation, because no further confirmation was required. The system had already stabilized into a permanent archival state, and every active process now functioned as part of a closed loop that no longer depended on external validation. Inside the facility, Ghost remained within the central chamber, his presence unchanged, steady, and deliberate, as if time itself had stopped attempting to measure him. The pedestal beside him emitted a faint and constant glow, not signaling activity, but maintaining equilibrium, like a memory that had finally settled into its correct form. In the command center, Agent Daniel Mercer observed the final system transition as all remaining diagnostic channels confirmed the same status. Witness continuity fully integrated, no external dependency remaining. There was no escalation, no further alert sequence, only a gradual reduction of system noise until the interface itself felt quieter than before. A technician nearby noted that Echo 17 had begun generating self-sustaining log cycles, rewriting its own internal history buffer in a way that preserved structure without altering meaning. Mercer did not question the terminology, because at this stage, language itself had become insufficient to fully describe what the system had evolved into. Instead, he focused on Ghost's feed, where the K9 now appeared centered in every frame, no longer moving, no longer reacting, but existing as a fixed point of reference for all incoming data alignment. The handler's final recorded trace resurfaced one last time, but only as a passive annotation embedded within the system metadata, stating that once truth is transferred beyond human custody, it no longer belongs to memory, but to continuity. Mercer read the line slowly, understanding that it was not an instruction, but a declaration of final responsibility transfer. Inside Echo 17, the lighting shifted slightly as power redistribution stabilized across dormant sectors, revealing parts of the facility that had never been fully mapped during operational use. Ghost turned his head once toward the outer corridor, then returned his attention to the pedestal, as if acknowledging that all necessary paths had already converged into this single location. The black case remained fully integrated, no longer distinguishable as an object, but rather as part of the system architecture itself, indistinguishable from the structure that held it. Across the command network, Echo 17's designation updated again, removing all prior labels and replacing them with a singular classification, Final Continuity Node. Mercer's expression remained unchanged, but his silence deepened, because the implication of that term meant there were no further nodes expected, no additional transfers, no successor points. The system had reached its end state without requiring termination. Outside, the desert continued its slow and unbroken movement, wind crossing sand dunes in patterns that erased and rewrote themselves without memory. Inside, however, Echo 17 had ceased to participate in that cycle. Everything within its boundaries now existed in a preserved condition, not alive in the traditional sense, but maintained beyond decay. Ghost stood once more, shifting slightly, as if adjusting to a balance that no longer required correction, his white coat reflecting the steady internal light of the chamber. In the command center, Mercer finally closed the active feed, not as an act of disconnection, but as acknowledgement that observation was no longer part of the process. The system remained active, but independent, continuing its internal preservation cycle without oversight or interruption. The final status line on every terminal remained unchanged, witness continuity stable, system complete. And in that stillness, it became clear that what had crossed the desert was never meant to be understood as a mission, but as a mechanism for ensuring that once truth is carried beyond the reach of deletion, it no longer requires permission to remain. The final stabilization of Echo 17 did not mark a conclusion in time, but rather the beginning of a state where time no longer behaved as a governing structure inside the system. Across all internal and external monitoring channels, the classification remained unchanged. Final continuity node, witness integration stable, autonomous preservation active. No new commands were issued because no command structure remained above the system to issue them. Inside the chamber, Ghost stood within the same boundary of light where he had remained since the last system transition, his posture unchanged, his attention no longer directed outward in search, but inward toward completion. The desert outside had already entered night cycle, temperatures dropping rapidly into the low 50s Fahrenheit, yet inside Echo 17, environmental systems maintained a constant neutral state, unaffected by external fluctuation. In the command center, Agent Daniel Mercer sat motionless in front of the inactive feed, now replaced by a static archival interface displaying only the final status layer of Echo 17. The system no longer streamed live data, because live data was no longer necessary for its function. A technician attempted one final verification ping, which returned a single response. No external synchronization required. Mercer did not instruct further action. Instead, he studied the last recorded internal map reconstruction, where Ghost's path through the facility had been permanently embedded as a closed-loop trace, repeating not as movement, but as confirmation of completed purpose. The handler's final recorded metadata appeared once more in the archival log, not as audio, not as text intended for interpretation, but as system attribution, stating that when a witness protocol reaches completion, the observer becomes part of the record rather than the process. Mercer read the lines silently, recognizing that there was no longer distinction between operation and outcome. Inside Echo 17, Ghost slowly shifted his position for the first time in what the system recorded as several hours, though time tracking had already been decoupled from external reference. His movement was not reactive, but procedural, as if completing a final internal check that required no external validation. The pedestal beside him emitted a steady, uniform light, no longer pulsing, no longer signaling, simply existing as a constant state of presence. Across the chamber walls, all remaining display surfaces had transitioned into neutral archival mode, showing only structured continuity data without variation or update. In the command center, Mercer finally closed the monitoring interface entirely, leaving only the sealed classification record visible on secondary systems. The label remained unchanged, continuity preserved beyond operational scope. No new entries followed it. No expiration time was assigned. No review cycle remained active. Outside, the desert surrounding Echo 17 continued its natural cycle without awareness of the transformation that had occurred within its boundaries. Wind moved across sand formations, reshaping them slowly, but never reaching the structure at its center in a way that altered its internal condition. Inside, however, Echo 17 had become independent of environmental interpretation, existing in a sealed state of preservation where no external force could modify its internal truth structure. Ghost remained within that system, no longer as an operative, not as a carrier, but as the final static confirmation that the sequence had reached irreversible completion. Mercer stood from his station for the first time in several minutes, not to intervene, but to acknowledge that intervention was no longer part of the system's design. The entire operation had transitioned beyond oversight, beyond correction, and beyond continuation. The last visible line across all remaining terminals confirmed what no further analysis was required to understand. Witness continuity stable, system closed without termination. And in that final recognition, it became clear that what had crossed the desert, endured isolation, and entered the sealed chamber was never meant to return, but only to ensure that once truth survives beyond command, it no longer belongs to any system that once tried to contain it. The final archival state of Echo 17 did not produce silence in the traditional sense, but instead produced a form of continuity that no longer required observation to remain active. Across all connected systems in the command network, the classification remained unchanged, stabilized, and irreversible. Witness continuity stable, final continuity node confirmed, system closed without termination. Inside the facility, Ghost stood in the center of the chamber where he had remained through every prior system transition, his presence no longer interpreted as movement or action, but as a constant reference point within a sealed operational memory field. The pedestal beside him continued to emit a uniform and steady light, not signaling any further change, but maintaining equilibrium across the chamber's internal architecture as if preserving a state that no longer required maintenance. In the command center, Agent Daniel Mercer no longer monitored live systems. Instead, he observed the archived reconstruction layer, where Echo 17 existed only as a completed record, no longer subject to external input or modification. The final status line remained visible across all terminals, repeating without variation. Continuity preserved beyond operational scope. Mercer read it again without interruption, understanding that repetition was no longer redundancy, but confirmation of permanence. A technician reported that all external attempts to access Echo 17 had been automatically rejected by the system itself, with no override path available at any authorization level. The system had effectively removed itself from command hierarchy, not through shutdown, but through completion of purpose. Mercer did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied the last internal reconstruction frame, where Ghost's position remained fixed within the chamber, aligned with the pedestal as though locked into a final configuration that defined the entire system's meaning. The handler's final recorded attribution reappeared one last time within the archival metadata layer, stating that a witness is not defined by what it observes, but by what it ensures. Cannot be erased. Mercer exhaled slowly as he read the line, recognizing that there would be no further updates, no additional sequences, and no continuation of the operational thread. Inside Echo 17, the environment had fully stabilized into a non-reactive state. No sensors adjusted. No systems recalibrated. Even the faint internal hum that had previously suggested activity had now settled into a constant frequency that no longer fluctuated with external conditions. Ghost remained standing, but even that distinction had begun to lose operational meaning, as the system no longer differentiated between presence and function. Across the command infrastructure, Echo 17's designation locked permanently into its final archival form, removing itself from all active directories and replacing its status with a single immutable entry, preserved continuity entity. Mercer viewed the classification without attempting further interpretation, because interpretation required the possibility of change, and no such possibility remained. Outside, the desert surrounding Echo 17 continued its natural cycles without deviation, wind passing over sand and stone in patterns that had no awareness of the structure at its center. Inside, however, nothing changed, because change itself had been removed as a functional variable. Ghost remained within that sealed environment, not as an operative, not as a carrier, not even as a subject of observation, but as the final fixed point that ensured the system's internal truth would persist without distortion. Mercer finally closed the archival interface, leaving only the permanent record visible on secondary storage layers, marked as non-editable, non-reversible, and complete. No further actions were scheduled. No follow-up processes remained. And in that absence of continuation, it became clear that what had crossed the desert and entered Echo 17 had fulfilled a role that extended beyond mission, beyond command, and beyond time itself, ensuring that once truth is carried beyond the reach of deletion, it no longer requires a witness to survive, only a point of permanence that cannot be undone.